Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. This will be the first webinar in our series of webinars, the FreeMind Summer School. And today's subject is Introduction to SBIR and STTR Funding Opportunities. And my name is Jonathan Adalist, and I will be giving the webinar today. As I mentioned, this is the first of a series of webinars we call our FreeMind Summer School. We do this every year, and there's a wide selection of topics. Today's, as I mentioned, is SBIRs and STTRs, but here's a list of all the other topics, and feel free to join any or all of them that you find will be interesting. I hope they are educational for you. You can also visit our website, and you'll find both the list there and the actual registration will be there as well. So a few words about who we are before we start. The FreeMind Group is a consultancy, and what we do is we help our clients raise funding from non-dilutive sources, various different sources. Today we'll be discussing one of those specific sources, and those are SBIRs and STTRs. And we've been doing this for about 16 years now. Actually, this says 45, but we have, I think, 47 full-time employees at the moment, so I'm sorry about that. We work across the life sciences, various different, both academics, university medical centers, independent research institutes, and also obviously the industry itself, anywhere from really small seed stage startups all the way up to big pharma. And we submit about, at the moment, 350 applications a year. So we know a thing or two about this. By the way, about 150 of those are SBIRs. So again, a great mass of experience and expertise going into this process. The way we go about doing that, we really view ourselves as a tool that our clients are able to use to maximize their funding potential. We do that by, first of all, identifying the best sources of funding for the clients. And then we strategize with them and create the applications with the most chances of success based on our experience, based on obviously presenting the science in the right way to make it adhere to the guidelines and to what they're looking to fund. Our connections there, we utilize all of that in order to really maximize the chances of an award. We manage the project itself, even when it's a complex multi-PI or a multifaceted project that needs really complex managing, we do all of that. We lead the joint application writing. We do that with the client, obviously, because we'll never be able to do it ourselves. We are not the experts on the science. At the end of the day, we're the experts on the grantsmanship and the non-dilutive funding landscape. And also, when relevant, we support final contract negotiations. I will actually be giving an example, actually a few examples of mechanisms where that is relevant, where there are contract negotiations as part of the process. So stay tuned for that. But enough about us. Let's talk about SBIRs and STTRs. First of all, I'll start by defining, I guess, what they are. SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. We'll touch on the differences there in a minute. But first of all, for both of these mechanisms, the general mission as defined is to support scientific excellence and technological innovation through the investment of federal research funds in critical American priorities to build a strong national economy. Specifically, the goals are to stimulate technological innovation, to meet federal R&D needs, to support commercialization of innovations, to support small business growth and development, and also specifically in many cases to support socially and economically disadvantaged small businesses, and also women-owned businesses. The SBIR and STTR programs are congressionally mandated programs. There's money set aside specifically for these programs every year. This is required by law ever since 1982 in case of the SBIRs and 1992 in the case of STTRs. Any government organization that is substantially funding R&D activities is required to devote a certain percentage of that budget, of the extramural research budget, to small businesses. In the case of SBIRs, it's currently 3% and looking to be increased over the next 2 years to 3.2%. And in case of STTRs, over the next 3 years being increased from 0.4% to 0.45%. This basically is meant for small businesses, so obviously you have to be a domestic small business. SBC is a small business concern. It's meant to help you engage in R&D activities and to advance your potential for commercialization. That's an interesting point, and this, in many ways, SBIRs differ from many other sources of non-dilutive funding in the fact that they could potentially support commercialization, which is something many other grants and contracts do not like supporting. And another thing I'd like to touch on here is the fact that I do encourage you, before going ahead and writing an application and submitting it and registering and going through the whole process, to visit the SBA website to make sure that you are able to be recognized as a small business. I will touch on the general stipulations, but it could be very discouraging to go through the whole process and then realize you're not eligible. So although I will touch on the main criteria for eligibility, again, I definitely encourage you to go to the SBA website and make sure. Okay, as I said, I'll touch on the eligibility. I'll do that right now. So you must meet all of these criteria to be eligible. First of all, you have to be a for-profit business located in the United States for obvious reasons. And at least 51%, so a majority of the ownership of the company must be either U.S. residents or U.S. citizens. Also, if the company is owned by a different company, then that company has to be majority owned by U.S. residents or citizens. So it's basically kind of like a series of Russian dolls. As long as the largest doll is an American doll, or mostly an American doll, then you're okay. No more than 500 employees. Obviously, if you're larger than that, you're probably not even considering being called a small business. And this is new, relatively new at least. This was changed in 2011 regarding VC backing. In the past, if you had VC backing, you were not eligible across the board. And the NIH, which is one of the major funders, actually changed that in 2011 as part of a few reforms they made that were intended on making their SBIR programs a bit more approachable for small businesses. And they changed that, and currently the requirements are to be either backed by no VCs as was before, but also if you're backed by multiple US-based VCs. So if the VCs are not American VCs, then there's nothing to discuss. But if you're backed by more than one VC and those VCs are US VCs, then you are eligible for SBIRs today. An important point also to note is that you must be eligible at time of award, not when you submit. When you are awarded, you have to be eligible. So as an example, if the size of the company changes or if the ownership changes, what really matters is what is the current situation and the eligibility at time of award and not at time of submission. Interesting point there. A few differences between SBIRs and STTRs. First of all, in terms of the general kind of purpose or goal of the mechanism, SBIRs are intended to support small businesses to increase private sector commercialization of their innovations. STTRs, on the other hand, are meant to kind of bridge the gap between the industry and academia, kind of exporting the ideas from the research institutions to the industry. So basically to stimulate a partnership of ideas and technologies between innovative small businesses and non-profit research institutes. In terms of requirements, for an SBIR, the primary investigator must be primarily employed by the business applying. On the other hand, it does not require such a partnership or a collaboration with an institute. In many cases, it will encourage that, and I will kind of touch on that, but it's definitely not required. In contrast to that, an STTR does not require primary employment of the primary investigator, but it definitely, since the goal is to create kind of that bridge for the transfer of the technology, it definitely requires a collaboration between a company and a not-for-profit research institution. These programs are phased. There's phase 1, phase 2, and there are a few different mechanisms there. There's also phase 2B, phase 3. We won't really touch on phase 3 here because they're not really relevant in terms of the funding agencies that do most of the funding and in terms of who's eligible for them. So we won't really touch on phase 3, but it is something that exists. I will touch on phase 2B and a few different mechanisms as well. But starting with the phase 1, this is for more preliminary research than obviously the more advanced phases. And the goal is to establish the technical merit, feasibility, and commercial potential of the proposed R&D efforts. So, like I said, it is for more preliminary research, and that in mind, the scope of funding is lower. For both SBIRs and these STTRs for phase 1, the cap is $150,000. That's not really a hard. It's defined as a hard cap, but the hard cap is you can exceed that by 50%. So it's actually about $225,000. In the case of SBIRs, over 6 months, and in the case of STTRs, over 1 year. It's important to mention, by the way, that there are various other sources of SBIRs than what we will discuss. We'll discuss primarily NIH and NSF, the Department of Defense. Basically, as I outlined earlier, any government agency that is awarding significant amounts of funding. In the case of SBIRs, over $100 million a year. In the case of STTRs, over $1 billion a year. They're required by law, and so many government organizations and institutes have SBIR and STTR programs. We're discussing these mostly because they're the most widely applicable and most relevant for the biological industry and biotech. But DoD has many of them. There are various organizations. Just important to realize that. Phase 2 award, and this is not entirely accurate. I'll say this and then I'll kind of backtrack and correct myself, I guess, in a couple of slides. But and this has always been true, and it's kind of true today as well, because the change to the phase 2 is actually a completely new mechanism. So I guess I would be accurate in saying that the standard phase 2 mechanism is intended only to continue R&D efforts initiated in phase 1. So you would, for a standard phase 2, and as I mentioned, there are new ways to go about that, but for a standard phase 2, you're only eligible if you previously received a phase 1. This is for more advanced research, obviously continue what you did during the phase 1. And the cap here, again, can be exceeded by 50%. So it's actually $1.5 million over 2 years for both the SBIR and the STTR. A phase 2B, or a competing renewal, is something interesting. Basically, you can, after receiving a phase 2 and carrying it out successfully, you can apply for another phase 2 when relevant. It's called a phase 2B, and that is basically meant to bridge whatever you carried out in the phase 2 and commercialization. And when that's relevant, you have to submit a new application, and it's reviewed, and it's the whole process all over again. But it is important to know that sometimes that is possible to receive an additional phase 2. A fast track is an interesting route to go. Basically, what you do is you submit both a phase 1 and a phase 2 together as one application. They are reviewed together as one application, and if you are chosen and awarded, what happens is you receive initially the phase 1 funding, And if you are successful in what you propose to carry out, you then automatically start receiving the phase 2 without needing to apply for a phase 2. So it's both of them are pre-authorized. There are a couple advantages to this. I think maybe the main one is that there's no funding gap. So if, as an example, you completed a phase 1 and then you decided, okay, I really want to go for a phase 2 now because we like getting money without any strings attached, which is fairly logical. And we also think we kind of have our foot in the door and they believe in us and we were successful, and it's a very logical thing to do. So you write an application and then you submit it, and then they review it and they get back to you with a score, and then after that they will decide if to award you or not. And then sometimes it can be almost even a year between the day you started writing the application and when you actually see the money. The fast track can either completely eliminate or at least significantly reduce that kind of funding gap between the phases, and for no other reason, that's definitely something that's, in my opinion, very attractive, if again this is something that is your project is fit for. Another advantage, by the way, is the fact that there's no additional review. So if it was initially approved, then you don't have to hope they'll approve your phase 2 because it was all initially approved. And in terms of success rates, it's actually not more difficult to receive than a phase 1 anyway, and I'll touch much more specifically on success rates in a few minutes. So it's a very interesting mechanism to consider. And this is what I was touching on earlier. This is a relatively new mechanism. The first deadline was April of 2014, so just over a year now. And basically, in the past, as I mentioned, phase 2 was only open for awardees of phase 1. They realized they were really not seeing the whole scope of high potential projects, and they opened it up completely to anybody who was at the right stage of development. So there is no longer required to be an awardee of phase 1 to apply for a phase 2. It's a different mechanism. It's a direct to phase 2 mechanism. It's different from the standard phase 2 mechanism. But there is a requirement here that you need to have carried out research comparable to what you would have carried out with a phase 1, although the source of how you funded that is not important. So basically, if you're a bit more advanced, you can apply directly now to a phase 2, and it's definitely better than kind of making up a not really necessary phase 1 just to advance to a phase 2, which a lot of people had been doing up until this change. Importantly to notice here that this is only for SBIRs. There is no direct to phase 2 STTR. SBIRs and STTRs have standard due dates. They were changed actually recently. The August deadline was bumped up to September, and December was bumped up to January. Now the standard dates are September 5th, January 5th, and April 5th. Additionally to the standard due dates, there are also specific solicitation SBIRs that have non-standard due dates, and it is important when touching on those and trying to apply for them to make sure you know when this due date is. If it's not a standard due date, it's obviously important to know that. So, success rates. Success rates do fluctuate to a certain extent, as you can see here. The red is for the SBIRs and the orange is for the STTRs. So STTRs are fairly consistent around the 20%. SBIRs went up and down over the past 10 years, but currently are also at about 20%. Actually, this year was a very good year for SBIRs. It went up by almost 5%. And there are a lot of factors going into this. It's a whole different debate. As an example, the main reason for the very high success rates surrounding 2008 for SBIRs was actually just low amount of applications, and then the decrease was attributed to lower levels of funding. So there are a lot of facets here, basically the take-home message here is, A, it's not easy, it's competitive. You need to really know what you're doing and how to do it to increase your chances of being awarded. But B, it's definitely possible. These are not insignificant or irrelevant percentages. These are real percentages. And this is the general average. If your science is better than average, or you have, as an example, very capable help in writing the application, obviously the success rates are can be significantly higher. Another interesting statistic is kind of a breakdown of these success rates to the different mechanisms. And you can see all mechanisms are currently on a rise, which is definitely a positive thing. The SBIR phase 2 has, as you can imagine, significantly higher success rates. And there is no current data for direct to phase 2 because 2014 was the first year that was something that was you could apply for, and many of the applications in 2014 have not yet finally been decided to be funded or not funded. Therefore, the NIH have not yet published their statistics on the directive phase 2. Well, we will be sure to update that in coming webinars, probably not during the summer school, but in the future once we have that information. Our personal experience, by the way, and this is by no means something definitive, but we have submitted quite a few, and our understanding is that the success rates are probably going to be somewhere in the middle between the bottom two lines of the fast track in the phase 1 and the standard phase 2, which was intended only to fund continuation of phase 1s. But again, that's based only on our experience and is definitely not something to take to the bank. The average award has been increasing pretty steadily over the past 10 years in both mechanisms, phase 1 and phase 2. And fast track is incorporated here, but this may not look like much of an increase, especially in the case of the phase 1, but actually both of them over the past 10 years have increased by about 50%, which is significant. And like I mentioned, there are a lot of different sources for SBIRs. The main one we'll be discussing now is the NIH, and not because there are not other sources, but because it is just a huge source of funding. Their budget, as you can see here, is over $30 billion annually, and a large portion of that is actually going out to extramural research, be it research grants, R&D contracts, all of that. So it's about 26 out of the 30-something billion that is really going out towards research. So let's talk some specifics. Fancy. So these are the parent announcements. Parent announcements are essentially open solicitations. We'll discuss, not in very great detail, but we'll give some examples of specific solicitations. There are quite a few, actually more than a few, specific solicitations for SBIRs that are intended on supporting specific types of projects and research and development. But besides that, even if you don't find something that's aligned, and in most cases you won't, because again, each one of them is very specific, although there are literally dozens of them, most of the funding every year goes out through the omnibus solicitations that are completely open, the parent announcements or the investigator-initiated SBIR and STTR. These mechanisms are completely open in terms of the research itself and what you're looking to carry out. It will be reviewed by a relevant study section, and then the institute within, in this case, the NIH, but it could be, as you can see here, the CDC, the FDA, the ACF, all of them participate in this solicitation. The relevant funding agency will fund it, but it's all reviewed just in general, and then the top projects are funded. So it's an interesting understanding to realize you don't have to find something that's specifically aligned with your science. Most of the funding is funded through these completely open mechanisms. The first one here is an STTR. This is the standard omnibus STTR. And as I mentioned, phase 1 is 150,000. It can be exceeded by 50%, so it's up to 225,000 total over 1 year, and up to 1.5 million over 2 years for the phase 2. The SBIR, similar sums. Actually, I apologize, but the phase 1 should say over 6 months for the SBIR. I should correct that. Regardless, both of these mechanisms, the upcoming deadline is September 5th. So I definitely, if you have something relevant, and I would imagine everybody here does because that's pretty much the only reason you are here, I do definitely encourage you to, if you have not started working on your submissions for this upcoming deadline, this is definitely the time to do that. This is the mechanism I mentioned, the separate mechanism for the direct to phase 2. It's basically identical to the phase 2 except for the lack of the stipulation where you need to have received a phase 1 in the past. Also 1.5 million over 2 years, and a very, very welcome change in the landscape. Again, September 5th, and again, get to it if you have not yet. Okay, besides the NIH, the NSF also has SBIR programs, as many other agencies do. These are worth mentioning because they are relatively, they are more specific than the NIH SBIRs that are, as I mentioned, completely open, but they're usually pretty widely applicable in many areas of the life sciences, and that's why I decided to share them as well. The sums of the scope of funding basically is lower. Phase 1 is up to 150,000, and phase 2 is up to 750,000. And the scope is basically an early stage R&D for small businesses based on innovative transformational technology with potential for great commercial and/or societal benefits. The program invites proposals from small businesses across a broad range of science and engineering disciplines. The topics there, you do have to go in there and check for the specific topics because it is more specific, as I mentioned, but they have advanced materials, biological technologies, smart health, biomedical technologies. So there's definitely a good chance you could find something that's relevant for you there. I have the link here as part of the presentation. By the way, worth mentioning, I will be sending out a slide deck to everybody who attended the webinar today, as well as a link to the recording. So you will have both of those. In terms of a deadline, the upcoming, we just actually missed the last one was this June, early June. But the next, there's always 2 a year, and the next one is December. So you have a few months to get ready and submit up until early December. Looking a little bit more in depth into the NSF SBIR program. So anticipation is about 200 SBIRs and 50 STTRs to be awarded this year. And the deadlines, the upcoming ones, as I mentioned, are December and then June of next year. Funding I already touched on, and there's a few more details here. PI has to spend, in the case of SBIR, at least 1 calendar month on the project. In the case of the STTR, 2 calendar months. In both cases, you will need, for phase 1, a feasibility and commercialization plan. Phase 2 is more devoted to development, and there is no fast track for NSF SBIRs. This is an interesting thing that many people are not aware of. NIH and CDC have SBIR contract proposals as well, not grants, but contracts. There are a few differences between a grant and a contract. Most importantly, the essential difference is that you're not granting your money. They are hiring you to carry out a set of specific R&D activities. So among other things, you're actually allowed to make a profit off of it and not just them funding what you do. There's also a phase of contract negotiations after you get a positive score, hopefully, and that is what I was touching on earlier, where that's something we help facilitate as well, the actual negotiations with the agency. But to be a bit more specific about the differences, so in terms of the scope, it is much more specific. There is no omnibus open investigator-initiated mechanism here for contracts. The NIH will define specific areas of interest, and publish specific contracts that they would like for you companies to apply for, and then you apply for them. If obviously that's within the scope of what you're looking to carry out. With SBIR grants, we definitely recommend it. When we do this with our clients, we always are in contact with the program officer, but it's not actually required. With the contract, it is most definitely required. The process is a process where you are in constant contact with the contracting officer. As I mentioned, there are 3 deadlines a year for grants. There is only one deadline a year, and it's usually in November. This year's contracts are actually expected to be issued very, very soon, literally within the next few weeks. So this is definitely something to keep your eyes open for. And these are great programs if you can find one that is aligned with your science, and it's, again, definitely worth keeping your finger on the pulse and looking into this. I touched on the basis of award. There's contract negotiations, and reporting is a bit more, the whole process is a bit more hands-on because it's a contract and not a grant. So there is either monthly or quarterly progress reports that you will not have in the case of the grant. Also, there is specifically money set aside for these awards, which is actually a plus compared to the SBIR grants, which there's no specific budget for in advance that they have to give out. In terms of the specific solicitations, the non-omnibus or non-investigator initiated SBIRs and STTRs, at the moment there are 93, actually this is true for yesterday, so I hope it's still true, but no, it is still true, 93 open solicitations with the NIH. So there really are very, very many, and I highly recommend you looking through them to see if there's one that's right for you. Because if there is one that's right for you, then that's definitely where you should be submitting, and not the omnibus. But again, if there's not something for you, by all means submit the omnibus. There are a few examples that I kind of added here, but these are really specific examples. As I mentioned, there are 93 different open ones at the moment. Feel free to look through these examples. I tried to give you some examples from each one of the different major institutes within the NIH, but there are literally dozens of others. So there are quite a few challenges, as you could see when I discussed the success rates. It's not necessarily easy. There are many challenges you have to overcome in order to be awarded. First of all, in terms of virtual companies, it can be challenging because they will require for a phase 1 67% of the work to be carried out in-house for the SBIR phase 1 and 50% for a phase 2. There are certain ways that can be navigated and kind of played around with, and there are some tricks of the trade that I probably shouldn't discuss at this moment, but it's important to understand, yes, there are definitely requirements. Sometimes that can be navigated in a way to allow companies that are completely virtual to do a bit more on paper than they actually did. STTRs have slightly different requirements, 40% by the company, 30% at least by the academic collaborator, and the additional 30% is completely open, so it could be the company, it could be the collaborator, or it could be a third party, CRO, different company, different academic, anything basically. These projects are development driven, they're milestone driven, not just a proposal that is like most grants, just you propose a set of ideas that you'd like to carry out and then that's it. You go milestone by milestone here. There are some atypical sections to the application itself that if you are versed in submitting grants, you will not necessarily be familiar with. Commercialization plan is probably the prime example, I would say, of those, but there are a few different atypical sections to an SBIR and STTR. And this is true, by the way, also for other sources of funding, but it's very important to really create a really coherent, full project covering all different facets and issues. and make it a very consolidated and coherent application. Let's discuss the review process, and this is actually taken from the NIH itself, but this is also very true for most other, actually probably all other funding agencies. So basically what they're doing is a risk management process. They're not investing like a private investor would, but it's still risk management in terms of what is the best way for this institute to invest its money in order to achieve that institute's goals. And the way they do that is by assessing the strengths and the risks. The strengths are something that you need to know how to convey in your application. And there are a few points there, and these are the actual specific categories that they will judge you on. Leadership, do you have the right PI, the right management of the company, that has the right track record and have the potential to really carry out what you're proposing? Do you have the right environment? Do you have the lab space, the equipment, everything that's necessary to carry out, again, what you're proposing? Is what you're proposing significant? Is there a real unmet medical need here? How innovative is the idea or the ideas? And these are all important, and the answer to all those 4 questions has to be yes in order for you to stand any chance of being awarded. But actually what really will win you the award is the scientific approach. You need a top-notch scientific approach to be awarded. And also, it's important to touch on the risks as well, to convey the fact that you know what the risks are and you will know how to hopefully deal with them when they arise. This is all basically the way you convey your project in the ways that maximizes the risks for them and maximizes, the strengths and mitigates the risks. And that is the way to hopefully put together a winning application. SBIRs and STTRs are a fantastic source of funding, but the way we look at it is that these are really a part, and in many cases an important part, but definitely a part of the real potential of non-dilutive funding to be a strategic source of funding for a company. They can in many ways be gateways to larger awards. So you could, after receiving an SBIR, you could go on to receive an R01 for a few $1 million. And then after that, maybe a DTRA award for double-digit millions, and then a BARDA for 60 million. It's all basically, once you have your foot in the door, it is definitely easier to win additional awards. There are a few reasons for that, but I guess most predominantly, the main reason is that you're going through a very, very rigorous process of peer review, and once you're awarded, that's a real seal of quality, saying that our science was reviewed very rigorously and found to be top-notch science, and they believe in us and they funded us. This is not just any organization funding you, it's the NIH or the NSF. So it's really a great gateway for larger awards. We definitely we would advocate submitting many of these. With our clients, we try to submit definitely no less than 3, but usually we try to at least 6 a year. So usually about 2 per deadline. You'd be surprised how many eligible and responsive companies just don't really submit many or any at all applications for other sources of money, even if they've been successful in raising SBIR or STTR monies. And there are a few examples here: R01s, R21s, U01s, but there are literally dozens and dozens of different opportunities and mechanisms. We really do suggest submitting every cycle, whatever you have the capacity to work on and submit. The success rates are, and different mechanisms have different success rates, obviously, but they're obviously not extremely high. But actually, we don't view that as a reason not to submit. We view that as a reason to submit as many as possible, because that is really the only way to make sure that this source of funding, non-dilutive funding, is something that can consistently produce results. Because if you submit, instead of 1 application, cross your fingers and hope to win, you submit 7 or 8, then obviously your chances of award are extremely higher than if you had submitted 1 or 2. So we have a very systematic approach to this. Basically, it starts off by knowing and really knowing the interests of the agency, what the current trends are in the different agencies, what they're looking to fund at the moment, each one of the mechanisms, really not only what they've published, but really what they're interested in, what they're looking for. You have to focus your project and make it adhere to that. You have to, obviously, in terms of budget, ask for what's necessary. You don't want to ask for too much for obvious reasons. You also should not ask for just way too little in hopes that that will mitigate the risk on their end. That is not how it works. They will actually view that as you not really understanding the scope of what you're looking to carry out. Have to present, and I touched on this, a complete project. So you have to touch on all the different facets of the project and make sure you have the capabilities and the manpower and the expertise to carry out all the things that you're proposing. And when possible, also to leverage on research collaborations. Targeting the right mechanism is definitely important, although in this case, there are the 2 omnibus solicitations that are almost always applicable. But still, when you have a specific solicitation, it's important to know which one to approach and how to approach it. Understanding the different sizes of award and success rates and what's right for you at the moment is also important. We always advocate looking at this strategically and conducting a real strategic assessment, understanding all the different possibilities, understanding when the deadlines are and what the chances of success are and what the stipulations are, and then creating a multi-submission granting strategy that will truly allow you to maximize your funding potential and hopefully raising a fair amount of money towards your R&D activities. A few words about the team. So as I mentioned, 47 employees at the moment. Most of those are managers and writers, smaller team of analysts, and the lead professional, our professional leaders are here mentioned. I would like to thank specifically one of our senior analysts, Dr. Katz, for helping me put together the material for this webinar today. And just kind of a general overview of our process, and I did touch on this, so I'll do this very briefly. Basically, 2 core services. The first one is the strategic side with our analysts, creating the multi-submission strategy based on your science, based on your compatibility and where that is aligned with the different agencies and all the different funding possibilities. Like I mentioned, SBIRs are an important part of that, but definitely there are various different other sources of funding. As you saw, 3% of the NIH budget is SBIRs, so 97% of the NIH budget is not SBIRs. And then also the project production itself, we help facilitate both of those. And kind of in a schematic view here, it usually starts by the upper left corner, the R&D funding needs of the client. We go through a multi-submission strategy, creating a long-term strategy. And then we create a sub-strategy, a granting strategy for the next few months. We carry that out, creating grant after grant after grant, submitting, review, and hopefully awards. And then round and round again we go. That is how we do it. I definitely recommend you do it in a similar way, if not with us, because this is truly the only way to take this source of funding and truly maximize the potential that is here. And there is real potential here. So thank you very much for joining today. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I will answer a few questions now. If you have any questions, just add them into the chat, and I will be more than happy to take them at this time. Let me see here. Okay. No, if I failed to mention this, I apologize. The NSF does not have a fast track, so you cannot submit for a phase 1 and then a phase 2 at the same time. You would have to complete the phase 1 with the NSF and then submit the phase 2. Okay, I have an interesting question here about the importance of collaborations. I guess the best way to describe this is this. There's definitely no requirement for, and this is SBIRs. STTRs, obviously, you need collaboration. That's the whole point of the STTR. The SBIRs do not require collaboration. They do recommend it for this reason, and this is not always true, but in many cases, a small business will not have all of the capabilities necessary to carry out everything, and in many cases, it is definitely advisable to collaborate. That being said, if you do have all the different facets covered in-house, there is truly no requirement to do that. If you have top-notch scientists in all areas, and you have the manpower to do it, and you have the facilities to do it, you do not need to collaborate. I guess that is the best way I can answer that question. Another question here about our success rates, I see. Different mechanisms have different success rates. Ours are typically, and there's variation here, but usually 2 to 3. In SBIRs, 2 to 3 times the average. Other mechanisms, by the way, can be even 4 times the average, but in SBIRs, usually 2 to 3 times the average is our standard success rate, pretty much if you average everything out. Okay, I can't see any other relevant questions that could be of interest to everyone. There are a few very specific ones that I'd be happy to address in emails.